which is truly serving the totality, all beings, human and non-human. So, in this one world in dialogue, I think the first question to ask is, what is the context, the in-depth, deep context in which we can even conduct deep dialogue? We have to feel we are rested in what is most true in order to be able to allow the springs of deep dialogue to arise and become transformative. So what I am, of course, proposing is that this deep context is our unity, but not merely our unity as an assembly of people, although there is that, but our unity as intrinsic, deep, indivisible, seamless in the nature of what reality is altogether. And that is what we mean by prior unity. It's this unity that is pre-existing, coincident with, and yet deeply beyond all these different appearances and experiences that make up our human life. So it's very important to understand that's what we mean, because unity can otherwise be about connecting a lot of separate bits into one thing. And that is not it. This is this deep pre-existing unity. Prior or a priori is the Latin term that is really where this word comes from. Already so, always already, you could say. And I want to use an image here because we're using words that they're a bit conceptual, and I want to be sensitive to the fact that those of you participating with us come from different cultures where you think in different ways, you learn in different ways, and so there has to be a balance between story and image and idea, if possible. And that's one of the, of course, bases for how we can all come to understand each other better. So I'm going to use an image for prior unity, and that image is the ocean. There could be few things more universal to humankind than the ocean, the greatest mass of water, and water is what our bodies are made of, what we live as. We live as water. So within the ocean, we have constant movement, constant flow, waves, in fact, sometimes really big waves, sometimes smaller waves. And you cannot pull apart this wave from that wave. The wave motion, the wave effect of the ocean is an indivisible flux. It's constantly moving, heaving, rising, apparently completely calm. That is where we are. We are as the ocean in our apparent differences, in our apparent rising and falling, appearing and passing away. People we know who have since died, they're all part of this indivisible prior unity in some ways that we cannot comprehend. All of life is arising in this prior unity. So it was this message about reality that inspired me as a student of OWiD, and at his instruction, in fact, to look at what would it take for human beings to found our social, cultural, political life on what is really the nature of where we are, what is really true about reality. Because we know that if we go against like laws of thermodynamics or law of gravity, to be very dramatic about it, we're going to end up in trouble. We're not going to get the results we want. So wouldn't it be just as true, even more true, that unless we learn and basically obey and live by the laws of this deep prior unity, we're going to be in trouble? I think the trouble is very evident to all of us. And I know that that is what is moving all of you to be participating in this course, to come together to deeply consider how we move beyond the lawlessness, you could say, by which we live now as a human civilization. So my part of the presentation is going to be looking at what you could call the understandings of prior unity from different directions and times and places and cultures. And then Leo will take over and he will speak about how do you bring that into life. So that's the way that we're dividing our time. But I want to turn now to not even talking about prior unity, even through images, but to a presumption that this is where we all are now in this moment, giving our heart attention and our feeling attention of mind and body and everything into this reality in which we are present. And to do that, I'm going to read some words like in the manner of a guided meditation, just for a few minutes. So you can simply relax, you can close your eyes if you like, and just feel, and don't even worry the mind too much about the words themselves. Just feel the flow of what is occurring and this mysterious, tangible depth, the ocean, if you like, where we're all together, non-separate. There is a universal conscious force that is indivisible, egoless, acausal, and absolute. And everything is arising as an apparent modification of that. A universal conscious force that is indivisible, absolute. Everything is arising as that. Reality itself is a prior unity. Everything arising is part of a prior unity. Everything is arising in that which is indivisible and self-evidently divine. Thank you. We are brought now into a sacred space that has been wonderfully evoked by a great Native American elder called Black Elk. Some of you may have read the book, Black Elk Speaks. And he speaks out of his own experience, but his voice is that of eons of time of the human indigenous peoples that have lived with no problem relative to this prior unity, with the obviousness of the unity of land and sky and people and river, and the unity of feeling within that, the heart unity of the people collectively, not just as individuals. So this is the first one that I'm going to give you as an example of different types of cultural understanding of prior unity. You have it in the work that was sent out and placed on the website, and I'm going to read it Now, I would just say, though, that this was from a vision that Black Elk had when he was only a child. Even 9 years old is what he said when he was recounting this much later in his life. And while I stood there, I saw more than I can tell and understood more than I saw. For I was seeing in a sacred manner the shapes of all things in the spirit, and the shape of all shapes, as they must live together like one being. And I saw that the sacred hoop of my people was one of many hoops that made one circle, wide as daylight and as starlight. And in the center grew one mighty flowering tree to shelter all the children of one mother and one father. And I saw that it was holy. I don't know of a confession from an indigenous elder that moves me more. It feels like it contains everything. And to know that it came to him as a child is even more moving, I think. First of all, it's this presumption of the sacred space of reality in which the deep visions of truth, the prophetic visions are given. It's a completely different space than the everyday downtown space. And he speaks of this shape, the shape of all things in the spirit, and the shape of all shapes. And what is that shape? He describes it first as a sacred hoop, which is, of course, a circle. And his people are a sacred hoop or a sacred circle. And indeed, councils, all kinds of activities within the community took place in a circle. But there are many hoops. In other words, there are many tribes, many villages, many families, many forms of humanity, and they make one circle. And it embraces all, wide as daylight, and it includes the heavens and as starlight. And then in the center of this sacred circle, there is this mighty flowering tree. Everything that is creative, fruitful, full of life and joy, arises, and beauty arises out of this common honoring of this unity, this in-depth sacredness of everything, the heavens, the earth, the people. And that then brings shelter, it brings protection, and it brings the certainty of being one family, one mother and one father. And then he comes back again. It is sacred, it is holy. All of this is sacred, all of it is holy. So, I won't say any more. It's such a wonderful, beautiful expression. Now I'm going to move into something very ancient. The indigenous world is, of course, ancient. And then there are also these very ancient civilizations that have developed, especially in the East, as taking the East as one very large, of course, it's not homogeneous, but one very large and somewhat distinct in its characteristics area of human civilization. And then the West, actually in a kind of dichotomy, as we know. However, what is there, as we will find, in the deep thinking, the deep understanding, the deep realization of East and West is this one thing again, the essential prior unity of reality. So I have just a few short things here to read to you that come from the greatest and most anciently surviving scriptures of ancient India, which are the Vedas and the Upanishads. The reality, truth, is one. The wise call it by various names, which again is, of course, the experience that we all know. that the heart knows something, but then our languages themselves give that different names. And then all kinds of ideas begin to come around it, and you can even lose the sense that it was the one that was being talked about in the beginning. Brahman is reality, knowledge, and infinity. So this Brahman is the word for the one in that tradition. It is everything. It is infinity. All that we see in the world is Brahman. So even all the diversity of what we see is still the one. And then to attempt to convey this through an image, which is quite elemental, literally, the writer of the Upanishad uses actually two elements, fire and then air. And so in the first one, it says, as the fire assumes different shapes when it consumes objects differing in shape, so does the one self take the shape of every creature in whom it is present. And you know, when you see the flames of the fire around a particular log or object placed in the fire, it moves, it's constantly dancing actually, and yet you cannot separate one flame from another. It's like the ocean in that sense, in the waves. And then, as the same air assumes different shapes when it enters objects differing in shape, so does the one self take the shape of every creature in whom it is present. So the air, we breathe the air, it permeates our entire bodies. The pores of our skin are affected. I mean, we're perspiring, where air is coming in and out of our bodies all the time. We're not separate from the air. So these are just some of the elemental ways in which the ancient writers attempted with this great gravity to convey the truth of the one. Now, when we come to the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, well, that's a very long and complex tradition. And I've given you a lot of quotes here, and I'm only going to touch on a few of them lightly because it may not be the kind of thing that appeals to all of you. It's very deep reasoning. It's very careful, exact, because that's the kind of culture that the Greeks had. They had a very complex language, and they had very active minds, I might say. And they liked to prove things, and then consider things, and then challenge things. And that is what you find, of course, in the dialogues of Socrates that were reported by Plato. But I'm going to refer now to Plotinus, who was a Greek philosopher, actually in the Common Era, what you could call AD, the 3rd century AD. And he was living in Rome in his mature life. And he had a circle of disciples around him. And in the tradition that they were carrying, it wasn't that you simply got together and talked ideas and were generally just intellectual about it. Not at all. Philosophy was a life and death matter. It was the search for truth, the extremely serious adventure into what is true. Because having discovered whatever that is, you would have to conform your life to it. So it had that spiritual and moral force to it. It wasn't just this realm, as I say, of ideas, which people might tend to think of as philosophy. So no matter how closely argued it may be, it's not an intellectual exercise, merely. Now, Plotinus, he's a famous philosopher who's called of the Neoplaton tradition. And basically, all that he ever came back to was the one. He used different terms sometimes, but he saw absolutely everything that exists as simply one continuum of being. And in fact, in the translation that is most used, the term prior unity does occur. Prior being a word that he used in relation to the one. So let me just, it doesn't matter if you don't have the material in front of you. I'm just going to refer to a couple of these little passages that I've included here. He says, we may think of the one as a light before the light, an eternal irradiation. One part of it is not here and another there. It is everywhere as a whole. Everything is possessed by it. And in another passage, he says that you can't actually name this one. He says you could call it that which has no name. So why would he say it was so undesirable, really, to name it? Well, that has to be because as soon as you name something, you've made it into an object. And once you've made it into an object, you've created automatic separation. There's you here, and there's it there. So has no name avoids or frustrates the desire to objectify what you're thinking about or you're seeing or whatever your experience is. And then he spoke about how can there be multiplicity or diversity in unity. And he had a lot to say about that. But one part that I thought was very interesting, he says our answer, meaning the answer to the challenge, how can you have a lot of different things and talk about a unity? He says our answer must be that the unity is that of a participation in the primal unity, with the participants remaining distinct from that in which they partake. So there are all these participants, just like there's all these members of the human family. We're participants, but if we participate in the primal unity, even of our one family as humanity, and then in greater depth, in the unity of reality, then it's not a problem. It's only created in the mind that there is a problem, a paradox there. And then he also says, you know, human beings at the heart know this is true. But then we get challenged to explain why in rational terms. And when I was reading this part to myself before the session today, I was recalling the interesting conversation that happened in our last session about this matter of intuition and rational thought. And is there a conflict or whatever it is? Well, actually, Plotinus is addressing this. He's basically saying, of course, the human heart intuits this intrinsic unity. But then we get asked to explain it, and we get complicated about it. And he actually says then that if we didn't have to do this, we would come to rest. And in fact, this is the firmest principle of all, this unity. It's the principle for which our souls cry out. There is nothing more deeply necessary to the human being than to be in touch with and participant in and deeply acknowledge and live by this unity. Our souls cry out. So then he speaks a bit about why the mind creates complications. I won't go on with that, but he basically says if you don't let all of that limitation create a problem, he says then you reach to the all as a unity. And this, he says, is not by any stepping forward or acting, but by the fact of being and abiding there where the all has its being. And so then he goes on to speak about the extreme potency and power and tangible reality of this unity. So I'm quoting, that awesome prior, the unity, is great beyond anything. Great not in extension, but in power. Sizeless by its very greatness. We therefore take the unity as infinite, not in measureless extension or numerable quantity, but in fathomless depths of power. It's that universal conscious force that we spoke of at the beginning. Now, time is pressing on, and so I'm going to touch quite lightly on the last one, but I have written a certain amount in the material on the website, so you can also study it from there. But I'm going to jump into the 20th century and into the science, quantum physics, and into the work of a great pioneer called David Bohm. He died in 1992. He was one of the leading figures in theoretical physics in the 20th century. And the really outstanding thing about him was that he was not only a very, very brilliant physicist, but he kept asking, what does it mean? What does it mean what we're discovering at the subatomic level of reality? It's not enough just to make equations, but why do we see things as particles here and as waves there? And how can we separate all these bits? They're not bits to separate. And of course, that had been the presumption of science especially from the 18th century in the Newtonian physics. So he commented that a lot of physicists were just content to make the equations and apply them in certain useful ways. And a lot of technology is dependent on those equations. But not so for Bohm. He had to say, what does this mean? This has profound meaning for the nature of reality. There's a piece about the hologram in the work that I sent out. I'm not going to touch on that, but just the way the hologram works is very interesting relative to prior unity. It's really suggesting that all information is encoded in every place. That seems impossible, but that's what the science points to. And now the most important thing that I've felt should be talked about amongst us today that Bohm does is he really makes us look at this matter of point of view. And he points out how scientific theories are all points of view occurring in a certain experimental context with a certain experimenter and a certain observed, and that has relative value. It has a lot of value in applications of different kinds, but how we must realize that it is limited. It's a particular point of view on something that is way bigger. So I'm going to actually read and comment further on that key quote that I've given you there about that. He says, all our different ways of thinking are to be considered as different ways of looking at the one reality, each with some domain in which it is clear and adequate. One may, indeed, compare a theory to a particular view of some object. Each view gives only an appearance of the object in some aspect. The whole object is not perceived in any one view, but rather it is grasped only implicitly as that single reality which is shown in all these views. When we deeply understand that our theories also work this way, and we could say our opinions and our beliefs work this way, then we will not fall into the habit of seeing reality and acting towards it as if it were constituted of separately existent fragments, corresponding to how it appears in our thought and in our imagination when we take our theories to be direct descriptions of reality as it is. Of course, we do that all the time, don't we? So this is a very, very salutary caution, a warning about the limits of point of view, which is, of course, what's going on in this world to the degree of madness all the time. And that is, of course, what the dialogue that Elizabeth and Thomas are leading us to is so key to understand and move beyond. So I won't say any more about Bohm right now, although it's one of my favorite subjects is to talk about Bohm. I'm going to end with this brief quote from Adida's book, Not to His Peace, because he's making two very important points here, I think. He's saying that really this matter of truth, that truth that the Greeks were seeking with such zealousness, and which human beings at heart are always seeking, says when you really reach truth, you are undone by truth. Truth transforms you. If you really touch to the truth of prior unity, then it transforms your life. What does your life become based on a real certainty, a real deep conviction of the truth of prior unity? So I'll just read this now. Undoing by truth is essentially what true moral and spiritual transformation is about. Moral, meaning a transformation of livingness. Good word, our livingness. That reestablishes human life in the universal context of prior unity and in the global human context of the constant exercise of the working presumption of prior unity. Leo will be speaking about that. Therefore, the truly moral disposition is the cooperative disposition, the disposition of tolerance, the disposition of compassion, and the disposition beyond compassion, which is true peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. And we'll move on, as Carolyn is saying, to really build on what Carolyn has given us in terms of this baseline, so to speak, relative to prior unity and talk about what does it actually mean? What does it mean in our lives to take this and implement it? First of all, it's important to note that OWiD said it's not a requirement for people to become enlightened or even highly developed to live on the basis of the indivisibility in which we participate. It's good enough, actually, to embrace the working presumption of prior unity. What is that working presumption? What are the elements of that, and how does that play out? And you could say the working presumption of prior unity involves such matters as deep and sustained cooperation with each other, tolerance of each other, being accountable for our actions, taking the totality into account in our decisions, and coming to a rested place that there really are no enemies at all. And what I'd like to do is to just share a paragraph from an essay where OWiD take these points further and then give you 3 or 4 examples relative to this. This quote is from an essay called "You the People." People commonly presume unity to be a positive value, but they're typically thinking of unity as something to be worked toward. Working toward unity is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about prior unity. I'm talking about people entering into a dialogue that's based on the working presumption of prior unity and non-separateness and zero confrontation and global indivisibility and the absolute law of unbreakable peace, rather than a status quo based on the ego-based presumption of separateness, conflict, and competition. There's an sterling example of this, of a leader embracing this working presumption, and that is Martin Luther King. We're all aware of Martin Luther King as really an extraordinary bodhisattva. And King, at the age of 36, gave a commencement address that I'll quote from briefly at Oberlin College near Cleveland, Ohio. This was 3 years before he was assassinated. He'd been obviously engaged as the leader of the civil rights movement in the United States. And Oberlin was the first Caucasian college to admit African Americans. So it was the first university in America to become racially integrated. And at the commencement address, which, as a good commencement address should be, was short, King said, "All I'm saying is simply this, that all mankind is tied together. All life is interrelated, and we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality." There was something that King grasped about this interrelated structure as being an intrinsic unity that really was the cornerstone of all of his actions, and thus naturally led him to a path of nonviolence, naturally led him to always be extending olive branches to what might seem to be opponents, and always being fearless, even until his last days. Another example of the working presumption of prior unity to point out is what happens when this working presumption begins to become embedded in a collective. And I think an excellent example of this is what happened in Norway. In Norway, on July 22nd, 2011, Norway suffered its worst terrorist attack since World War II. There was a right-wing extremist, Norwegian, who was very disgruntled with the way the government's liberal immigration policy was moving. And he decided to really create horror as a reaction to that. First thing he did on this morning was to set off a car bomb near a government building that killed 8 people but injured over 200. And then he went to an island near Oslo, dressed as a police officer. On this island was a conference of teenagers, of young people that were affiliated with the ruling political party. And dressed as a police officer, he murdered 69 teenagers and injured over 100. And so in the midst of the horror of all of this, what was the reaction of Norway? First of all, the leaders gave communications to the entire country. I'll share just a couple of quotes that are so deeply instructive. Haakon, the crown prince of Norway, said, "Tonight, the streets are filled with love. We're all facing a decision. We cannot change what happened, but we can decide what it does to us. We can decide to stand together. Every one of us can make this decision. You can, and I can. We want to live in a society which offers the freedom of opinions and speech. We want to understand differences as possibilities. We want freedom to be stronger than fear." And the Prime Minister said, "We must never cease to stand up for our values. We have to show that our open society can pass this test too." And the mayor of Oslo said, "We will punish the guilty. That punishment will be more generosity, more tolerance, more democracy." And tens of thousands of Norwegians went to squares in towns and cities and villages all across Norway with roses to leave in commemoration of those that died, in solidarity with the living, and as a symbol of strength and love. And I must say, there is in the pre-reading material a 3-minute YouTube video that is so moving of these events that happened in Norway. And also, as an American, it touched me deeply to watch this and to contrast it with the reaction that happened in America after 9/11. It's remarkable. It's absolutely remarkable. Another example that is really tentative, but I think instructive, is what's going on right now in Syria. Syria we think of as such a tragic case of chaos and mayhem. But in the northeast corner of Syria, wedged in between Turkey and Iraq, controlled by Kurds, Syrian Kurds. And they have remarkably and unexpectedly started an experiment in participatory democracy, where at the village level, people are involved in talking through, in a dialogic process, all the issues that a village is facing. And then this happens similarly at a cross-village level and at a regional level. And the interesting thing is that the leaders of this process include young people as well as old people, not just traditional politicians, include women as well as men. And a hallmark of what's going on is, this is in Syria, that these groups are committed to taking the welfare into account of everyone, regardless of ethnicity and regardless of religion. And this beacon of tolerance, this nascent flower that's happening is in some sense embodying this working presumption of our prior unity. You know, the last example maybe it's not even evolved as an example yet, but it makes a point, is we're all aware that the Paris Accords at COP21 just concluded in terms of an address to climate change. And that there was an agreement among 192 countries to limit global warming and to report on carbon emissions. Critics of the agreement say it won't go nearly far enough to stop the trend in global warming. But others say, well, wait a minute, hold on. This is actually on record as the greatest diplomatic achievement of all time. 192 countries coming together. And there was a moment right at the end when things were stuck. And what the French did is they introduced a dialogue process in Daba, taken from the Zulu tradition, that enabled everyone's voice to be heard in relatively small groups. And these Indaba groups worked through the night, in some cases 2 nights, to make sure that everyone's concerns felt heard. And it strikes me that just given the nature of this course, One World in Dialogue, that this spirit of participatory dialogic process is utterly has the power to be transformative. And the extent to which, at least the facilitators in the process, understand that there is this inherent unity, then amazing things can happen. And if we just think of the whole matter of climate change, and it's not just the Paris Accords. You remember earlier in the summer, the Pope issued an encyclical around climate change. And 6 times in this encyclical, he's talking about the interdependence and interconnectedness of all life and how we need to acknowledge there's only one atmosphere. It's a unity. It's a unity. And we need to act on that basis. And so I'll leave us with just this thought, or conclude with just this thought, so that we have some time for questions or comments. That we tend to think, and given our language structures, that if this all sounds good, then we're embracing prior unity. But as Carolyn pointed out, prior unity is not a philosophical proposition, but actually is the deep and vast and unfathomable intelligence of reality. And so another way of understanding this is that prior unity is embracing us. And the extent to which we are open to and participate in a process of dialogue that expands the capability to be transparently available to this unconscious universal force for the good of all of humankind. Thank you. And hopefully, Thomas and Elizabeth, there's time for a question or a comment or two.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you both very, very much.
Thank you both very much. In fact, we would like to open now the possibility for question and answer. And I would suggest you see down on the lower part of your screen the chat box. So if you have a question, you can write your question into the chat box so that we can unmute your phone and bring you on screen. So you find this chat box on the lower end of your screen. And if you just want to raise your hand, just you don't have to put your question in, just you say that you want to talk, then we can unmute you.
Yeah, I just want to, instead of typing your full question in, you can just say, I have a question.
Exactly.
And if you're on camera, if you're on video, you can raise your hand if you'd like, and we can open your mic.
Okay. Joanna, I will unmute your phone. Hi, Joanna.
Hi. This was a beautiful presentation, and I really enjoyed the reading. But I'm left with a question that I don't like, especially. And that is that if it's all prayer and we're all one and everything has meaning and we're all interrelated, why is there a need for individual awareness at all? Isn't it just going on? That's my question. It's a disturbing question to me because it could mean that you go along and people die and people live and there's what we consider evil and what we consider good, and that Boko Haram serves a purpose and to be embraced as part of the whole. I think of one of my favorite books is The Lives of a Cell by Lewis Thomas, if you're familiar with it. It's a very short little book. And he talks about the world as, he says, what is the world most like? He says, really, it's most like one living cell. And then he takes us on a wonderful journey, looking at different creatures, and until he winds up saying that a human being can never say I again. We are we because we're composed of so many living organisms that are cooperating and fighting and living and dying, and the whole thing makes us a human being.
You've cut her off.
So you can't say I anymore. And that's not conscious.
Great, Joanna. Just would like to give Leo and Carolyn also a chance to answer.
Please.
Thank you so much. And Leo and Carol.
Well, I'll just make a few comments. It's a profound question, and it's a question that should be asked. I think one of the things I would say is this apparent need for individual awareness. It has something to do with the fact that these bodies arise. We have to move around in space. We have to operate. Indeed, so do non-human four-legged creatures too. If we didn't have a brain process, a neurological process that allowed us to observe from our point of view where we are in space, to make intelligent assessments about how to respond to our environment, we wouldn't live very long. So actually, our process in the brain too, our sense of point of view, which creates our sense of separate awareness, it's a product of the necessities of our mechanism. It's not a great ontological reality, but that's what we turn it into, you see, because of the very facts of how we're structured as a mechanism. So deep spiritual thinkers have addressed this over endless time, really, and said, yes, there is this self-awareness, and it has its purposes and its realities in certain contexts, but don't be deluded by thinking that's the total truth, because the separation that then gets activated and believed in based on how our camera of point of view works, that is our perception apparatus, that isn't the total truth. That's an operational necessity.
Thank you, Carol. We also have another remark from Rod Stanbrook. Rod, I will unmute your microphone.
Hello, it's actually Uli on Rod's camera.
All right.
Okay. Hi, Uli.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carolyn and Lee. That was very powerful and evocative. I realized while I was listening to you that my experience shifted a little bit because, you know, I'm German and there's a lot of dispute right now going on in Germany in light of the refugee situation. Very radical views are rising to the surface, and I have a website where people are expressing these views. And I just realized while I was listening to you that somehow it reframed my experience as in some ways, you just want to push these attitudes away. You just want to go, no, I'm not going to engage with this. This is just too crazy. I'm not going to. And when I was listening, I realized I have to, because my response is actually the pain of this lack of unity, not recognition of this unity. And so in whichever way one can, one has to find a way to somehow respond. And whether or not it's possible, I don't know. But I realized that one can't draw a conclusion based on this difference. And that's a very, it kind of puts you in a very unknown place, really, in many ways.
Yeah, there was a year ago, there was a movie that came out called Selma about Martin Luther King and the march from Selma to the state capitol. And it's a very interesting portrayal of how King, in the face of utter, not only craziness in terms of crazy opinions, but brutality, to the point where some people in the march or with him at that time were killed, actually killed by the police. And that even those moments when he was most distraught, he was able to stay with the thread that there must be an intrinsic unity. Because if these police or this police superintendent, Bull Connor, were viewed as an opponent, automatically he's into duality, into separation. And then it's one force versus another. And it doesn't reflect the underlying reality. So it's an interesting portrayal of the agony of what he went through to really hold this truth that he knew in his heart to be so. And I must just say that I read with deep admiration for what the German people are grappling with on this issue. It's the maturity. I mean, I know there are wacky elements, but there's something very admirable about this. So thank you for your work.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Uli. And I think right now we've come to the end of your portion of our session today, and just a very very warm thank you, Carolyn and Leo, for helping us see sort of the universality in the human experience and human civilization and culture of this deeper recognition of prior unity, and the practical application that it's from this place of unity that surprising things can happen in terms of human culture and the solving of problems that seem impossible. So thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And I'm sure that your perspectives will accompany us through all the course. I think we live in a particular time where we recognize in a way that we never have before that there is a unity amongst us as a human race that can be embraced in a new way. And you said something very particular that I just want to repeat because I find it so important. That this is not a unity that we do work to, it's a unity to come from. To make it simple, you said it in a little different way. And I think to really grapple with this question will be part of this course, because I think that changes the perspective. And I think that's also the work presumption that you're explaining. It changed the perception to already come, at least from the assumption of unity, that superposes my separate perspective, which doesn't say that I don't have my individual perspective. We have to talk about this too, that this has to be important. But there's something that comes to the picture, and this is exactly the prior unity you were talking about. So thank you both of you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Most welcome.
And yeah. Okay, so we will say goodbye at this point, and for the rest of you, we'll continue with the last half hour of our session together. So, do you want to? Yeah, great, terrific. All right. So what we want to speak about now is in many ways talking about what does it mean to bring prior unity into dialogue? Why is it so important for the kind of dialogue that we're trying to do?
That's great, and it's important in two ways.
Mm-hmm.
Because in one way, I think there's a difference in dialogue work. There are many dialogue works that are very powerful, very helpful, but there's a certain kind of dialogue that comes from a perspective that there is already non-separation in the dialogue field. And just to see that embracing individual perspectives is an important part of dialogue, but seeing that there's something that is unified already just because we are in a relationship field is a different perspective that I think is very important for developing dialogue. Mm-hmm. So that's part of it. And the other, because what we're doing here, we are doing a global perspective. Mm-hmm. And realizing that all the different perspectives on a global scale, different cultures, we have to see them from their respective unique perspective. And that's why we wanted to have Carolyn and Leo bring this presentation. There has to be seen something different also. Is it possible to hold a kind of a potential field for the whole globe, for whole humanity as one, as a perspective that comes with the different perspective that we also have to hold? And this is something that allows to have a global activism from a different point of view.
Yeah, I think the point of what this field is, I think is really important. That we're when you say we're starting from a relational field, what you're speaking to is a prior unity. You're speaking to a recognition that when you and I, or when we together are in relationship, in conscious relationship, that we are already, there's already a unity, there's already a one, there is already a something that is in some ways unnameable that we are part of. And there's the dimension of us here now as that, and that taken to a larger in kind of a larger view, not just us as individual human beings, but us as representatives of, or kind of windows into, different dimensions of cultural reality that are on this planet, that are also in dialogue and forming a larger unity.
Yeah. And I think that this is also the power of a conscious dialogue work. It is a training field to really become aware of this dialogical field, because just being on this on the screen here and on the microphones, we can see each other and we can appreciate our otherness, and that's a big part of what we're doing. But on a subtle field, or maybe not so subtle field, there's also an awareness that because we are together on this call, we are already together in something. Mm-hmm. And this something, whatever it is, and maybe it's just a niggle of something, we don't really know what we are talking about. It's just because we see each other, hear each other, there's something we are together in. There's a possibility to relate to this something that is undivided. Mm-hmm. So this is a learning field, because usually we are so trained to just see our own perspective that dialogue allows to see, wait a moment, there is something of a prior unity, at least a prior unity between us, that cannot only be assumed, but can be experienced. And this is something that in any kind of dialogue work, and also in a global dialogue work, is something that makes a huge difference.
Well, I think that what you're pointing to is when Leo and Carolyn speak about the presumption of unity, or the working presumption of prior unity, which means that we're going to work from an assumption that we're all together, and that we're all from a place before we even begin. We're all part of this oneness. But what you're saying, and I think, and part of what I find so exciting about the dialogue work and the potential of dialogue, is for us to, when you said it's a learning field, that we can learn to actually experience this. We can learn to sensitize ourselves and our consciousness to be able to become aware of the fact that between us there is this already unified, already one process that we're a part of.
Yeah.
And it's I think it's some of the power of dialogue when we begin from this place of or begin even from this working presumption, saying, okay, I'm going to accept kind of in a more conceptual way that this is so, and I'm going to I'm going to lean in here and begin to try to sense the truth of it. That it's that learning that can happen there that ends up giving us a ground in something very very different than the usual way of not only just perceiving for myself, but seeing anyone who is not me as other.
Yeah, because in fact that's what we also hope that will happen in the smaller groups, that there is a training field to experience something about this consciousness field, about this relational field in real time as we're talking with each other. Because one thing that helped me to understand this is that you really can say that this field between us of consciousness can be seen on 3 different levels. And one level is that it exists already anyway in the second that we are in any form of relationship, if you're aware of it or if you're not aware of it. In the moment we are somehow in any form of relationship, there is some kind of field between us, and we don't have to be aware of it. But the nature of this field of consciousness between us changes dramatically in the moment that we start to become aware that this is so. It's like being an individual and being an individual who becomes self-aware are 2 different stages of being an individual. You can be an individual, and in fact, the human species and every single one of us goes through this development of being an individual first, and at some point being able to say I, and being self-aware that we are an individual. The same is true in the awareness of this field in the dialogue process, that it changes dramatically as soon as enough of us become aware that this is so. In fact, in the dialogue process, well, what we can experience is there's a real shift of the gravity field from the individual to the collective, as soon as there's a critical mass of people who can hold this different perspective. And just not to go too far into this, talk about the 3rd level, because being aware of it is the foundation, but being aware of it does not necessarily mean that I care for this shared field. So it starts with being aware that there's something between us that you can call this field of consciousness. But if a certain amount, the critical mass of us starts to really care for this more than for the individual perspective, that changes the gravity field again in a dramatical way. So there's the awareness level and there's the care that is really the foundation of a conscious dialogue work that we try to achieve. Because if this is held, conflict, what usually is conflict in any form of a dialogical situation, can become something like a creative friction because it can be held in a shared field. And this is what dialogue work I really can bring to this assumption of prior unity.
Well, it then moves it from being an assumption to being a reality or a felt reality.
Exactly.
And that shift is incredibly important, and one that we hope that you will begin to develop in through this program. I also wanted to bring in something about the what you were speaking about in terms of the second and third points. One is, okay, so prior unity, as all the sages have said, is prior to even my being aware of it or anyone's being aware of it. It is, but then there's becoming aware of the unity between us as we're engaging, and then the care that you brought in. Now, what's interesting to me is I think one factor in that care coming in is the experience of, or is the recognition that that is between us, that is this prior unity, this dimension of oneness, is what human beings recognize as the sacred or as holy. Carolyn used the word holy in relationship to what Black Elk said, that there's a recognition of something holy in the very stuff of existence, the very stuff that out of which, or the sense of which, that makes us not separate. That in that non-separation, in the conscious realization that we are not separate, there is a very fine and subtle resonance that touches the human heart in a way that calls forth a response that is, oh, this is something and somehow that I am beholden to, that I am deeply grateful for. It has that kind of immediate impact on the heart, and when perceived from the heart, it creates an opening to what human beings have always called sacred or holy. And I think that is often where the beginning care for this dimension comes in, or becomes, it becomes, it's what motivates us to care.
Yeah.
Because we realize this is somehow so important.
It's also interesting that in the moment that one starts to look at this shared space that we have between us as at least potentially something sacred, the relationship between what we are holding changes in one's own experience. And one doesn't even have to define what sacred or holy means. That's, in fact, I just see it as a deep form of appreciation.
You say gratitude.
Gratitude, exactly. You don't have to come with any metaphysical definition what the word sacred or holy means. It's just, it expresses a relationship. And as soon as this is something that can be also experienced as a potential or as a reality, the care for this shared space can be held in a different way. And the dialogue practice usually really makes a great shift when this is something that can be held on a consistent level. It's similar to acknowledging the dignity of other human being, which is also a recognition of a sacred dimension in the other human being. That just being human means to be someone dignified, and she deserves to be treated dignified. In the same recognition, to recognize this in this space that we are sharing together, something in our relationship changes.
I want to. What you just said is beautiful. I think the word dignity is often not a common word that we use anymore, but the recognition of the dignity of the human is a very profound thing, very, very profound thing. And what I appreciate about what we're kind of going into now is that we're speaking about how dialogue gives us access, can make real the prior unity, and to be able to see it and see what it is in a deeper and bigger way. And I wanted to say a little bit more about, because what we would like in this program, in this course, is for you to be able to tap into this truth of prior unity in the course of dialogue, and that seeing that as a critical foundation for any work that one wants to do with other human beings in order to take a group of people forward. But developing this sensitivity to that which is between us is a kind of, I'm sort of moving my fingers by my ear, is sort of, it's like when you become sensitive to music, or begin to be able to identify the way different birds make sounds and that they're different species. That the capacity to sensitize oneself, to be able to be really awake to and to what happens in the in-between, what happens in the intersubjective, what happens in this prior unity that when we meet each other is already present. That one way to really support that, the development in our sensitization to this unity is through the practice of meditation.
Yeah.
And because the practice of meditation is about the realization of one, the realization that fundamentally there is no other. There is only one. And it's a mystical insight that is at the foundation of meditation. We're not simply speaking about meditation as a relaxation technique, but in the kind of going to the bottom of what meditation is. It is a practice of realization that reality is one.
And even if you don't go so far to the realization of oneness, in the meditation, even if your expectation in meditation is more kind of a cautious one, it is a practice to dehypnotize oneself from the fixation on oneself. Because meditation and talking about meditation is kind of a silent meditation on emptiness, or however you want to call it, where basically the practice is just to let everything be as it is, and you don't do anything with it.
And let everything be, meaning all the stuff that's going on in your mind, anything that you're feeling.
Yeah, let it be in terms of let it go. Confronts us how we usually don't do that and grab it to ourselves. And just to have a practice of even get a little looser with this, holding it to ourselves, allows to start to perceive reality in a different way. Because a big part of the dialogue work is, as you said, is a sensitivity training. To start to become aware of something that usually we are not used to pay attention to, because our highly individualized perspective has a certain perception of life that is not focused on this intersubjective space in the same way. So we usually we are not focused there, and we have no training to perceive. And as you said, like there's certain tunes in music you only hear with little training. You need to sensitize you that there's something you haven't paid attention to see or to hear. It does exist. And this is so important because as soon as there's only a tiny little bit of recognition that this intersubjective space is something that does not exist just in theory, but it exists in my perception, as tiny as this may be, it's a fundamental shift because it allows you to give a different reference point to relate to. In the moment this is reality in your own perception, you have a different reference point, which is not just your individual perspective of reality, what it means to this individual perspective, or this intersubjective, interpersonal relationship where basically it's an I, you perspective. The field perspective is different than this. And in the moment one starts to develop this perspective, the reference point can grow.
And meditation is important for that. As you said, to bring the 2 points together, it is a cultivation of, it is most fundamentally about the recognition of unity. And the way you get there is by first sort of disidentifying from the constant head talk, the constant voices in one's mind, the constant reference to my experience, and a beginning attention to all that is, and and everything or nothing. To begin to root in that, and then that brings you into dialogue in a different way. In some ways, it brings you in from a perspective of that is open to the field that we're speaking about, open to the field and open to a different kind of relatedness, a different type of relationship that is not, as you said, not interpersonal and not egoic nor interpersonal, but allows one's attention to be focused as a point in a field, and that is what we're going to be practicing in our dialogue groups, and you can see how this position of prior unity is so important for us then to create a space in which that holds the truth of unity, and then and this is what we're going to speak about as we move through the course, and then is also able to recognize and hear and engage with difference and often intense differences from a very different vantage point. We have a couple of comments that we can take, and then at the very end, we'd like to speak about what you'll do next in your dialogue groups.
So first, Jen, I will unmute your phone.
Do you want to read your comment?
You want to read your comment? Okay. Should we read it? Okay.
Yeah, okay.
You want to read it?
Yeah. It seems that in an accepting dialogue, I can hear the sincerity of an individual and experience both my disagreements and questions as well as agreements in the moment. Then I can express myself while in the emotional as well as intellectual experience. That allows me to share and learn while accepting and being accepted. I hope that's clear. I think it's clear.
It is. In fact, what we are talking about is a third option. Because on one hand, there's my perspective, and on one other hand, there's a sensitivity for the other perspective, which can be the other perspectives, depending how many people are in a dialogue. And both is important to really have a sensitivity to one's own perspective and to the other perspective. But the third is that there's something in the field itself that has its own gestalt. it's like this famous expression that the whole is always bigger than the parts.
Greater than the sum of the parts.
Greater than the sum of the parts. To see that in the whole that we are holding in this dialogue that we are having right now, I can see my perspective in this and how I relate to us talking. I can see you and everyone else, and I have kind of a relationship to what I'm seeing and can respond to that. And then I'm seeing something that is the gestalt of the whole of it. And the whole of it has its own potentiality, has its own potentiality field. And that's sometimes not so easy to grasp. But it allows us, and that's the power, it allows to hold something together that otherwise, as you were talking about agreement and disagreement, can easily fall into conflict. Because all of a sudden, what could be conflict could be just a very creative tension between us. As long as we don't fall apart, but hold this tension, because we are aware of this, the potential of the whole that we are in, and we are interested to hold this. What is felt as tension doesn't become destructive. It can become very creative.
It's like layers where I can feel the tension, but at the same time, there's a holding that allows me to be comfortable and happy in the tension because I'm aware of more than what's going on between the two of us. I'm getting inspired here to write something different in my blog, a healing recovery blog, and people come to it, and I hadn't thought of it in these terms, where I'm holding a healing space. I'm holding.
It makes sense. It makes a lot of sense.
And people from all over the world come with their different perspectives, looking for individual healing, but they're making something.
Yeah.
They're making something that I want to call attention to beyond individual healing and maybe beyond what we even have a fantasy about.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I think because so much of our sense of trauma, hurt, or need for healing comes from a sense of dislocation or deep alienation, then the whole that we become aware of and begin to be aware that we're even creating and participating in can become a healing factor in itself.
Yes.
Yeah. Shall we, Susan, you had a comment. Do you still have your comment? Oops.
We have to unmute
you. Okay.
Susan, now you're unmuted.
Carry us along. It's. I would say that what Tom was talking about in terms of this third perspective, because my comment would have been from either the first or the second perspective, and then having this third, and then I'm wondering whether seeing this third perspective, which in my experience would be being in dialogue with somebody, having an awareness of unity, and realizing that who I'm dialoguing with knows that, but is not aware of it in terms of being able to talk about it. And so, I don't know whether that is something that'll come up in this context, but because in this context, anybody could say, let's talk from the third. Let's, or at least lean in and think about how we could do that.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting what you're saying, Susan, but because basically it refers to two completely different dialogue situations. They also have to be understood in a different way.
Right.
Because what you were referring to our dialogue situation is that we can co-create something where we can lean on each other. Of course, the degree that this is possible, that we can lean on each other in holding this third perspective and responding to the whole, the whole can be empowered in a way that really gravity shifts in a quite dramatic way. There are many dialogue situations where you just cannot assume that because the other doesn't see it or is not interested in it, whatever the reason is, it's just not the case. But still, one can hold this. And I think it's worthwhile to talk at some point to talk about these two forms of dialogue. One where we can co-hold the shared space, and one where we just can hold to the degree that's possible something in a space where maybe other people are not aware that there's a hole that they also could respond to.
And it seems that in that second, in the one you were just talking about, that there would be little teeny, like pinpricky moments, you know, where it's like you could become aware that somebody's talking to you through this non-assumption of unity.
Yeah.
And you can almost touch the fear and the it's almost real. And then there it's like you just kind of keep holding, not aggressing on it. Maybe even that's part of what care is about. And eventually there'll be little teeny places where something will get real, you know.
No, that's fantastic, Susan, because I think that's at least how I understand it. Because one way how I understand this dialogue work is constant looking for resonance of this. And if there's no resonance, basically you have no chance. You can't force anyone into resonance. If, as you're describing, if there are tiny bits of this, I would call it resonance to this, you can build resonance on resonance. And
you can call it out of them by your holding it.
And it's your skill and your sensitivity to which creates your ability to call it out, as you say.
I see.
And also your capacity to hear it or to be aware of this, because maybe someone is in a very different place and even thinks in a very different way about it, but in spite of the different way of thinking, there is resonance that one can build on. And sometimes, at least my experience, the result is very surprising because I'm not responding to my intellectual perception of the situation, but there's something that we can resonate in and build on in this resonance, and all of a sudden we end in a very different place than I had assumed we would end up with. So,
do you think it doesn't even have anything to do with what you're saying sometimes? So like in terms of the term dialogue, there's a whole different, it's like an energetic almost.
Yeah, that's right.
As strange as it sounds, that's my experience.
Yeah, so in some ways, these kinds of foundational aspects are often more important than the content.
Yeah.
And it's working this kind of resonance and the places where there are discord, but again, it's sort of like we're looking for discord, like in a piece of music, right? In a piece of music, often notes that are discordant create a greater depth and richness and complexity in the piece. Yeah. So it's like it's our responsibility in terms of learning this way of working to be able to hold that, hold the fact that we're creating a piece of music together. You know, that we're co-creating something.
Yeah.
But I think we need to. We're actually now a bit over time, so sorry about that.
No problem.
And I know Angelo just sent us a comment. Let's see. Okay, great. I think everyone can read your comment. Thanks so much, Angelo. And
thank you.
And for your groups in your dialogue groups, for your next dialogue group, I'd like you to explore prior unity, meaning what is make sure you understand, you know, what is, and try to articulate, each of you, what is prior unity, and this idea of a working presumption of prior unity. What does that mean? How does that change your experience in the group? so we want you to just really focus on what, what you've heard in the presentation, to flesh out any questions that you have, places where you're not clear. On January 10th, I believe, we have our next question and answer session. So bring anything that arises in the groups, either as a comment about a difference in these differences in perception and perspective, or questions because you're not clear. Bring those into our Q&A session next time. And also, we would recommend that you begin, to whatever degree you feel comfortable with, taking on a consistent meditation practice. If that's 20 minutes a day before you go to sleep, if that's 15 minutes a day in the morning, if that's I'm really going to do an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening, that's fantastic. But it should be right for you and consistent. And and again, meditation, we're talking about sitting still, paying attention, and relaxing. And letting everything that goes on in your inner world space and in your body, letting that be the way it is. And in that way, letting go of being so identified with it. So that is a very simple 30-second description of what meditation, of how to go about doing meditation if you don't have a practice already. And we're recommending in this to do a meditation without mantra, or without visualization, or without the kinds of things that would kind of encourage may encourage your mind to work.
So if you have your own practice, feel free to follow your own practice. If you're interested in the meditation that really has this focus to develop this inner freedom, this would be our recommendation.
Yeah. Freedom from this attachment to ourselves, so that we're open to have more sensitivity to the field between us.
I'm sure you'll talk more about that.
Yeah, ongoingly. But so I think at this point, maybe we could unmute everybody, and anybody who's on the phone and not. There we go. Hello. We can see more faces. If you'd like to come on camera,
yeah.
You're welcome.
Hello.
Hello. Come on camera so we can say hello, goodbye, and wishing everyone a wonderful, beautiful, happy. Oh, yay! Hey, we got a little one there. A very happy New Year and joyous holiday season.
You too.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey, thanks a lot.
Bye. All the best
Bye.
Merry Christmas.
to you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Ciao. Mm-hmm.
Ciao.
Mm-hmm.
Miss Bold.
Ciao, buona tarde.